7 states are currently considering legislation which would ban unauthorized children from attending public schools. Such legislation challenges a 1982 Supreme Court ruling which guarantees a free public school education to all children, regardless of immigration status. Reporters have also included a link to the 1982 Supreme Court ruling, which might help you. Speakers this week will discuss the wider consequences for American society of a ban on birthright citizenship. So please welcome Dr. Hiroshi Motomura, Susan Westerberg Prager Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law. Dr. Motomura will present a pre-recorded interview, which was conducted by my colleague, Pilar Marrero.
I'm Pilar Marrero, Associate Editor at American Community Media. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Hiroshi Motomura, the Susan Westerberg Prager Distinguished Professor of Law and co-director of the Center for Immigration Law and Policy at UCLA. He's also the author of Borders and Belonging Toward a Fair Immigration Policy. Professor, we're speaking at a moment when the future of birthright citizenship is once again in the national spotlight. The U.S. Supreme Court is expected to weigh in the coming months on President Donald Trump's executive order seeking to restrict it, raising profound questions not just about law, but about the country's history and who gets to belong. You have spent many years helping us understand immigration, citizenship, and what it means to belong in the United States. So, when we're talking about birthright citizenship, that is someone born in this country, that person is a citizen with a few very narrow exceptions. We don't have to get into those. Are we really debating immigration policy, or are we debating what kind of country the United States is meant to be?
Well, I think fundamentally we are debating what kind of country the United States is meant to be. You can think of this in legal terms, but fundamentally it's really about a national vision and a key part of American history.
The U.S. had already said that some people, especially Black Americans, could never belong. How much was this amendment about correcting that exclusion and redefining who counts as American?
Well, there's two ways to think about the 14th Amendment, and one of this is focused on the situation for Black Americans, for African Americans. There's a Supreme Court case, the Dred Scott case in the 1850s, that said that essentially the Black people could not be citizens. And so in one respect, in significant respect, the 14th Amendment was intended to overturn or remove the stain of Dred Scott on American history. And this, of course, is a big part of what the American Civil War was about, was to end slavery. And the southern states continuing or wanting to continue slavery. That is one way to think about it. But the other thing that the 14th Amendment does is it enacts a very broad vision of America that goes beyond simply simply overturning Dred Scott. And I don't want to use the word simply here because, of course, this is very monumental. But even more monumental than overturning Dred Scott was the idea that the 14th Amendment embodies an inclusive vision of the United States. It embodies a rejection of hereditary or inherited citizenship from your parents, but really is designed to be what is appropriate for what became a nation of immigrants, which is that people arrive and they're included and they have a stake in the society moving forward and into the future for their children and grandchildren.
You mentioned that it really targeted the idea of starting anew or not having to depend on your inheritance or your parents, etc. So if I think about many places in Europe, your parents have to be citizens in order for you to be a citizen if you're born here. But in the United States, we have the 14th Amendment. So what is the big deal about being born here makes you an American, no tests, no conditions? Why was such a powerful shift for America?
Well, first, one thing that's important to point out is that the United States does have this form of birthright citizenship is very fundamental to its national ethos. But it's not the only country that does this. many countries that have seen themselves as nations of immigrants. In other words, were settled by immigrants largely. Many countries of that type, I mean, Canada, for example, or many countries in the Western Hemisphere have this idea. And you're right that there are many countries in other parts of the world where in citizenship is more hereditary. It's from your parents. But what the United States is doing is actually fairly common historically and currently for countries that have been seeing themselves more as nation of immigrants. So what does this mean? Well, I mean, I think one of the things it does is it's a very forward-looking, envisioning perspective on citizenship. It says the function of citizenship is not something that is some after-the-fact recognition of your parentage, but really citizenship is a vehicle for belonging. And so, for example, many people to come to the United States, they don't feel, or they shouldn't feel, I think, and this is the 14th Amendment's idea, they shouldn't feel excluded because they don't have the right parents, the right grandparents. Everyone has a legal foundation to belong and to take part in society and actually to contribute in significant ways to that society. Now, citizenship, of course, is not enough to belong. It's not enough for equality. The civil rights movement is very much about that, but it is a necessary prerequisite. Without that citizenship, it's absolutely important because it's part of feeling that you are part of the national project. And I think that one of the things that is at stake in this executive order from the president is turning away from that vision and returning more to a sense that this country is not is really not for everyone, but only for a relatively few. The number of people who would potentially lose citizenship under the executive order is counted in the millions, really. I don't have an exact estimate, but we're talking about a lot of people, and I can explain why if you want. But it's basically a huge number of people. So it's historically significant, it's numerically significant, and I think in broader terms, it's a very much changing vision of America. And in that sense, this case before the U.S. Supreme Court, I think, is one of the most monumental and important cases that the court has seen in modern history.
If it happens, so what happens to a society when large groups of people are born and raised in a country but are told they don't fully belong? Can you project on what could happen?
Well, I can answer that at two different levels. The first one is a very practical level, and that is that the executive order says you're not a citizen unless you have one parent who is a citizen or a lawful permanent resident. So it would take citizenship away from people who certainly from people who are undocumented and have children. Those people are currently citizens. It would also take citizenship away from people whose parents were perhaps studying, let's say as graduate students, for a number of years in the United States. It would also take citizenship away from people who are in some kind of worker status, and I don't mean just 30 days or 60 days. I mean for 5 years, for 7 years, this type of thing, or even longer potentially. So it really reduces the number of people who become citizens. But one of the things in the executive order it says is it only applies in the future. That's what it says in Section 2. But one of the things that one of the justices brought up in the oral argument for this case is that there's nothing that requires the executive order to apply only to the future. If the Supreme Court were to redefine citizenship under the 14th Amendment, it would really be something that would reach back into the past too, because once you interpret the Constitution, that's what it means. And so this is why I come up with the figure that this would involve millions of people who are now living, but of course millions of people in the future as well. And so these are people who would essentially be, I suppose you could say, second-class members of society. And I think that's a very profound change. And it's a very profound perspective on what it means for America's future.
A lot of people that I've talked to have said, "Oh, no worries, it's not going to happen. The Supreme Court is not going to change the Constitution in this way. They're not going to ban this. They're not going to allow this executive order. Even if they don't, what is this discussion doing to our society, you think?"
Well, I think that you're asking a very important question because I think it puts the question of birthright citizenship into a broader perspective in this political moment. I think it's very clear that the Trump administration's overall immigration agenda is not just an immigration agenda; it's an agenda about who belongs and who does not. And so, from that perspective, you see a lot of things that are connected with each other. One is the use of racial, ethnic, and language profiling in making arrests inside the United States, not just at the border, but inside the United States. The other is militarization of immigration enforcement through the National Guard and through the way that ICE has been operating with its pattern of arrests and shootings or killings, actually, and military gear and this type of thing. But the other piece of this is to think about birthright citizenship or the attempt to redefine birthright citizenship as part of this program to return America to, I think, a vision of America that might have existed in the 1890s or something like this. And so the message sent by the executive order is very profound. Now I happen to think that the Supreme Court will strike down the executive order, but and I say that as a person who doesn't like to make predictions or has has lost confidence in my ability to predict exactly what will happen. But I'm more confident about this than I am about other things. But I think that the real point of the executive order and its profound impact is to send a message about who belongs to America and who doesn't. And this is, unfortunately, something that is fundamental to the executive order, and it will linger no matter what the Supreme Court does in the next, I assume the decision will come out at the latest at the end of June of 2026.
Yeah. Professor Hiroshi Motomura, thank you so much. I appreciate you and the time you took to be with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Well, that was an excellent interview. Thank you so much, Pilar. Let's begin with Dr. Philip Connor, who will discuss the multi-trillion-dollar hit to the U.S. economy if the ban on birthright citizenship is upheld by the Supreme Court. Welcome, Dr. Connor.
Hi, Sunita. Really glad to be here today. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I am Philip Connor. I'm at Princeton University at the Center for Migration and Development. And I want to share with you an economic study that I and other colleagues put together in advance of the oral arguments. It was released a couple of weeks ago, prior to the oral arguments. My co-authors, Matthew Hall at Cornell University, as well as Francesca Ortega at Notre Dame University. I want to recognize them as part of this project. And this project was organized through the cooperation of the Center for Migration Studies, and it was published in the Journal on Migration and Human Security. So as we've already heard from the professor, we have seen of how this is first and foremost a legal case. This question before us, as this executive order has been taken to the Supreme Court. But I and my colleagues wanted to get a sense of the economic impact, or at least the economic accounting of birthright citizenship beneficiaries in the past and currently and into the future. We know that much social scientific research have looked at the benefits of immigrant children having U.S. citizenship and how they've been able to break a number of generational barriers in terms of their economic position, in terms of mobility, in terms of career. But we wanted to give a sense of putting some numbers around that, those contributions that birthright citizenship beneficiaries have given over the past several years. Now, our approach is to lean on existing U.S. Census Bureau data, surveys that many of you have probably filled out over the years, like the American Community Survey that may have come to your home, or maybe you recalled for the current population survey, the one that the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses typically for measuring unemployment rates. We rely on those data, and I'm not going to get into the methods, but allows us to basically identify those in the survey that likely benefited from U.S. citizenship at birth to 2 undocumented parents or 2 temporary immigrants living in the United States. There's a lot of hurdles to be able to obtain those identifications of people within the data, but we went through some very conventional as well as innovative methods to be able to do that. And so I wanted to state here that these estimates are conservative. Why? Because we are leaning on the fact that those two undocumented parents or two temporary migrant parents are still alive today and are living in the United States. And so therefore we are missing out on many people that could have benefited from birthright citizenship um, in many ways. Maybe they used to live in the United States, maybe they were born in the United States, but now have since moved to another country. Maybe their parents are no longer living. Maybe they are no longer living. Maybe they were born to an undocumented single parent that we don't know the immigration status of the other parents. So there's a lot of people here that could be missing. And for that reason, I want to emphasize that this economic accounting is conservative. In fact, it could be as much as double or more than what I'm going to share with you today. So we identified in these surveys of individuals born since 1960 and born through to what we expect to 2045 to number at least as 4 million beneficiaries. Again, very conservative. It's likely could be as many as double depending on the assumptions that you put within the data. Now, we found that these people live across the United States, but earlier adults that are currently in the workforce primarily live in 3 states, California, Florida, and Texas. But as migration patterns have changed over the years, we've been able to see of how it's far more distributed in terms of U.S. citizen beneficiaries to two undocumented or temporary immigrant parents have encountered all across the United States. Now, looking at these data, we're able to lean on the fact that we know what the adults that are currently in the workforce, of what their beneficiary kind of status is as U.S. citizens born in the United States to two undocumented or temporary migrant parents. We lean on their educational experience. We lean on their labor force participation, on their occupations to predict what may be occurring among those into the future. Those that are currently children and benefiting from birthright citizenship, and including those yet to be born and would benefit from birthright citizenship in the next couple decades or so. And by doing that and looking at that entire population, current working adults, those that are currently children, those that are children yet to be born in the next 2 decades, we found that basically about 2/3 are or will work in occupations that typically require at least some college. That gives us a sense of the fact that they are able to make these gains as U.S. citizens into the post-secondary education sphere, gains that probably would not be permitted if they did not have U.S. citizenship. So a great gain in many ways to the U.S. economy because they're able to access that education to then increase in their occupational mobility over their work lifetimes. That number's total in terms of actually 3.1 million beneficiary workers total, of which about 2.1 million, about 2/3 as I mentioned, are in these occupations that we would deem more or less higher skill because they require a higher level of education. And then we also wanted to tally up their income contributions, their contributions to GDP over a century-long period. Now, I realize that's a very long period of time, but we wanted to get a sense of those that are currently adults in the workforce, born since 1960, those that are yet to be born, and because of that, you have to look at this kind of century, 100-year period. And when we use 2024 dollars, we're talking about money as it's talked about today, we were able to estimate across those populations that at least $7.7 trillion in their income is contributed to the U.S. economy throughout that century period. It is an enormous amount of money. It's an enormous amount of contributions to the economy. And we alone looked at just those that are yet to be born in the next 2 decades. And alone that group in the next few decades will contribute as much as 1 trillion or more to the US economy during that time period. So the impacts of their contributions are sizable. These are baseline estimates of their economic contributions. We did not calculate kind of a counterfactual scenario. What if birthright citizenship didn't exist? This is just basically a baseline to get a sense of how much is being contributed in their occupations as well as their income. But certainly more research could be done on this front. And as well in terms of their fiscal contributions, we didn't calculate that as well, but there's much more work that could be done. Nonetheless, I want to emphasize again that if birthright citizenship in this executive order were to if this executive order were to stand, we would see some major impacts into the future, especially for those that are yet to be born in the next couple of decades. A potential loss of that $1 trillion, as well as the potential loss of about 400,000 workers in higher occupations in terms of those that would require typically some college. And with that, Sunita, I'll turn it back over to you for any questions from the audience.
Yeah, Dr. Connor, we're going to hold questions until all the speakers have presented.
Excellent, great.
But I'm going to ask you just one question before we move on to Dr. Gellert. Besides tech and healthcare, which we'll discuss later, what other economic sectors will face a shortage of labor? Do you, for example, expect a hit to the agricultural sector?
So these are what we were able to see are those that actually are already participating in the labor force that we identify as beneficiaries of the U.S. citizenship, who were also born to two undocumented or temporary migrant parents. So for that group, as I mentioned, about 2/3 are in occupations typically involving some college. That includes occupations such as office administration, features close to the top, healthcare, management positions, education. These are kind of the typical occupations that you would think of that require some college education. The other third are in occupations that may not require that higher level of education, including, and not almost exclusively, but including some like transportation and construction and foods preparation and services, agriculture, if you will. This is somewhat different than you would think of as a newly arriving immigrant that may have fewer capabilities in terms of language use and so forth, as other factors that might involve in terms of occupations that might be open to them. But as U.S. citizens born in this country, they are able to actually access post-secondary education, and therefore we would see them appearing, and we do, in these kind of professions that require these kind of levels of education. So all jobs are important because during labor shortages that we're going to experience in the future in a variety of industries. But particularly for this group, having access to education and post-secondary education is going to be a really important aspect of their future and for the future of our country.
Dr. Connor, thank you. We will take questions for you after all the speakers present. And reporters, please continue to enter your questions in the chat. After Dr. Gellert and Zhao Wang have presented, we will take questions. So we next go to Dr. Gellert from the Migration Policy Institute. Dr. Gellert, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sunita, and it's nice to be with all of you today. Talking about this really important topic. At the Migration Policy Institute, we looked at this question in a little bit of a different way, looking at some of the demographic impacts of ending birthright citizenship as President Trump has attempted to do. And this is work that I did with my colleague Michael Fix and also with MPI non-resident fellow Jennifer Van Hook, who's at Pennsylvania State University. We started with the understanding that the goal of President Trump's executive order was to reduce illegal immigration and to reduce the size, therefore, of the unauthorized immigrant population. But we find, in fact, that the executive order would do quite the opposite. Because children would be born in the United States without legal status if they didn't have birthright citizenship, the unauthorized immigrant population would actually grow by 2.7 million more over the next 20 years and 5.4 million more over 50 years compared to what we would see if current interpretations of the 14th Amendment were to continue. This reflects our estimate of the number of children who would be born to unauthorized immigrants or temporary workers in the United States without citizenship or legal status and would live out their lives in the United States. And importantly, it includes children over this 50-year time span. It includes children born to today's unauthorized immigrants and even the grandchildren of today's unauthorized immigrants who might be excluded from legal status if there were no pathway for people born here without status to find their way to status. Looking at the numbers a different way, we estimate that about 255,000 children on average each year would start their lives in the United States without status. Some might choose to leave the United States, some might find their way onto legal status, but they would at least have that early experience of not having legal status. The broader reality of this is that repealing birthright citizenship would create a self-perpetuating class excluded from social membership. This would span across generations. Some of this has been mentioned, but just to kind of put everything together, this means that kids would be growing up in the United States without access to Medicaid, to food assistance, to other public benefits. When they experience times of need and hardship, they wouldn't have that government safety net below them. They would, as Dr. Connor mentioned, they would have constrained access to higher education. Unauthorized immigrants are excluded from federal financial aid and often from state financial aid. In some states, and we're seeing a movement on this policy topic at the state level, in some states, unauthorized immigrant kids have to pay out-of-state tuition to attend college. And more importantly, they would grow up knowing that they aren't able to work legally in the United States. This would lead to lower educational aspirations, because what is the value of striving towards a college degree or a graduate degree if you can't use it to work in a professional job? We have seen the converse of this in the United States with the DACA program. A cohort of unauthorized immigrant youth were given access to work authorization and protections from deportation. And what all of the research has shown was that led to higher high school graduation rates, higher college enrollment rates, higher college completion rates, more employment and higher paying professional jobs. So we know that having that access to work authorization and to some at least tenuous claim on belonging helps people to aspire to higher achievement and to achieve higher incomes and more economic stability. Furthermore, if we didn't have birthright citizenship, the US would be maintaining a growing population that has no voice in our political system and has a tentative sense of their belonging in the country. The US has, compared to other countries around the world, had an exemplary record of immigrant integration across generations, where the children of immigrants far surpass their parents' success. Repealing birthright citizenship threatens to really harm and jeopardize that record that we've had. I wanted to touch on two other issues. One is the issue of statelessness, and some conversations around the repeal of birthright citizenship talk about stateless children, and I think that is an important concept. I did want to note that some countries, many countries, allow children born abroad to their nationals to obtain citizenship from their parents by descent. So it's possible that in this repeal of birthright citizenship scenario, that many children in the United States could hold the foreign citizenship of their parents. However, the requirements and the processes and the administrative burden involved in obtaining that citizenship differs depending on parents' home country. So that may be more readily available for some children than others, but nevertheless, having that citizenship within the United States doesn't really help one situation growing up in the US. The other issue, Sunita, you brought up the Plyler v. Doe case. And this case is related in many ways to birthright citizenship. Without birthright citizenship, we would have a much bigger pool of children in the United States who, if Plyler v. Doe was also repealed, could be excluded from the public education system. So this was a court case that was decided in 1982. There was a Texas school district that was charging an enrollment fee for unauthorized immigrant children, and a class of Mexican children, unauthorized immigrant children, sued. As Dr. Motomura discussed, there were issues related to the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause, and whether all children in the US are eligible for equal access to a public education system. The federal government was involved in writing an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief in this case, arguing basically that the federal government should maintain control over immigration issues, that it's a federal power to control immigration, not a state power. The court ruled in a 5-4, so narrow ruling, that the district did have to allow those children to enroll regardless of status. And the majority in the court said that any savings that schools had from excluding children would be far outweighed by the harms that would be imposed on those children and on society from denying them an education. And furthermore, that children shouldn't be held accountable for their parents' actions, that violated concepts of justice. On the other hand, the dissent argued, and we're hearing a lot about this argument right now, that the court was making a policy decision that went beyond strictly the legal questions in the case. This year, there are a handful of states, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A, that are considering bills that would either ask children to prove their immigration status as they enroll in school or to bar unauthorized immigrant children from public education. And the bill in Tennessee is the one that everybody is watching to see if that might trigger a direct challenge to Plyler v. Doe. But I will leave it there and turn it back to you, Sunita, and look forward to the Q&A.
Yeah, Julia, I wanted to ask one question before we move on to Zhao. So this would obviously exacerbate the issue of mixed status families with one child having citizenship and all of its benefits, including public school, while the other child does not. Could you address that a little bit?
Sure. The most common mixed status family scenario in the US today is that parents don't have legal status, but their US born children are born as citizens and have legal status. So without birthright citizenship, we would see fewer of those kinds of families. But we might see other kinds of mixes of legal status that emerge through marriages or through blended families or all kinds of other situations. There are, and there can be very stark differences in experiences that children have depending on their legal status. Today, it's common that in a family, maybe one child migrated to the United States without authorization, and a younger sibling was born in the United States. That younger sibling can sometimes be an anchor to have access to some things that other members of the family can't, which as families share resources can be helpful. They also, as they get older, can be kind of the face of the family in situations that might otherwise feel difficult in interacting with schools or public officials or law enforcement or other kinds of situations. So families, that's putting a lot on those US born children, but families in the absence of birthright citizenship wouldn't have those US born children who are sort of the anchor of the belonging for the family.
Well, thank you. Very much appreciate your comments. And we reporters, as I mentioned, we will conduct Q&A after Zhao Wang presents. Zhao, welcome. Zhao will discuss the potential shortages of highly skilled talent from abroad who may choose to immigrate to other countries with stable paths for their yet-to-be-born children. He will also focus on the shortage of professionals at rural hospitals and nursing home staff, which are already facing shortages of staffing due to changes in the H-1B rules. Welcome, Zhao.
Thank you for having me, Sydney. And I'm really glad to have a moment to talk about this because, you know, when we talk about birthright citizenship in the news, you know, the chatter and conversation has always been around sort of what's the constitutional doctrine? What does the Constitution say? What is a court case? What's legal theory? And those matter for the sake of the challenges that are going on and the legal arguments, but they miss the side of the debate that I feel like doesn't get enough attention that has long-term consequences or impacts the country, which is this is the side that shows up in hospital staffing and research lab staffing, and really about what happened years prior around those family dinner tables. So a ban on birthright citizenship is not just about changing the legal rule, it changes how talented people around the world think about building a life in the United States. Right? The talking point is around eliminating birth tourism, which is a near-term and in-time issue. But the significantly damaged consequences in the long run, which is if you're a highly skilled worker, whether it's in technology, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's any other field, and you're deciding where to build your future and your family's future, you're not just looking at the salary or title or the organization, you're asking the bigger question around like, can I build a stable life in that place, right? Can I raise my family there? Will my children be secure there? And these questions matter especially in places that are already struggling to attract and retain talent, including our rural communities across the country. And for many families, the message from this executive order on birthright citizenship is that even if you come legally, right? Even if you work hard, even if you do exactly what America asks of you in this process, your children's future here may still be uncertain. And so, focusing on just rural healthcare as a spotlight for a moment, the Association of American Medical Colleges project that the United States could face a physician shortage of up to 86,000 doctors by 2036. At the same time, immigrants account for over a quarter of all physicians working in U.S. hospitals. And the shortage is even more urgent and prevalent in rural America, where a analysis in 2025 found that immigrants make up of only 5% of the overall rural workforce, but 14% of physicians and surgeons in rural America. And that's almost 3 times their share. So if you think about what those consequences mean, if you know from the modest amount of international physicians, nurses, and other clinicians and healthcare workers decide that America is becoming too unstable of a place to raise their family, and the first places to feel it will not necessarily be the wealthy urban hospital systems, but there'll be these rural hospitals already struggling to recruit. And it will be these nursing homes that can't find enough aides and the long-term care providers, right, deciding if they can safely staff another set of beds or wings. And it's these older Americans, disabled Americans, families in small towns and rural communities who will bear the largest burden of longer wait times, fewer providers, and more fragile care. And these changes may feel long term, but we are also, this administration is simultaneously hurting the short term with the recent $100,000 fee attached to H-1B applications from abroad, which is one of the primary pathways for foreign doctors to come and practice in the United States. And unless this new bipartisan exemption bill passes soon, we are already seeing, just in rural California, as an example, clinics pausing on hiring dozens of desperately needed doctors because of their inability to afford this high upfront fee. And so when I think step back and think about this issue as a whole, it should be framed outside of what the 14th Amendment says or doesn't say, or what like subject to the jurisdiction thereof means. It's a debate about what kind of message America is trying to send to the rest of the world. And the truth is that the birthright citizenship has long done more than just confer legal status. It's offering clarity, right? It's told families that if your child is born here, your child can belong here. If you're here, your child can stay here. And that clarity matters because it reduces fear. It allows people to plan with confidence. And so now, do we want the question at hand is really, does America want to continue to be the place and country where the best people around the world come and build and discover and heal and stay? Or do we want to be the country that tells a brilliant engineer, a gifted physician, a nurse willing to serve in an underserved community that we welcome your labor, but your family's future is still up for debate? And the countries are competing with the United States, who are also desperately in need of healthcare, and workers are seeing this as an opportunity. Canada is simplifying pathways to doctors. United Kingdom has a dedicated health and care visa. New Zealand offers permanent residence pathways for in-demand medical roles. Australia has also skilled visa programs to fill health care worker shortages. So in other words, other countries are leaning in the moment when US is leaning out. And so this ban on birthright citizenship not only would break with the long settled American practice, it also weakens the way that makes the United States the place that high skilled talent wants to go. And it would put additional strain on an already weakened healthcare system, and it would hit hardest the rural communities that have the fewest buffers and the highest need.
Thank you, Xiao. We'll go to questions from reporters in a minute, but I have the first question. How difficult will it be for a US-born child to get citizenship from their parents' home country? I expect you have a lot of clients that are already asking that question. What happens if that child cannot obtain citizenship? Are you expecting a surge of self-deportations of families who cannot obtain citizenship from the home country for their child?
I think it varies a lot by country. And this is all presuming that the the court rules to support the CEO, but it can range from being pretty automatic in certain countries like Mexico to very difficult and bureaucratic and very time-bound, such as like Japan or in certain cases, United Kingdom or India. And so what we'll see is first a lot of concern and a lot of uncertainty around what the right pathway is, followed by a flood of misinformation as everyone looks to the internet and AI and any resources they have on hand to be able to determine what's happened. And then we're going to find that there's going to be a number of folks who are going to be falling through the cracks where they failed to file the correct form in time, or their parents don't have their birth certificates handy in ways that will delay a lot of people from being able to understand what they should do next.
Interesting. All right, we go to questions from reporters. Henrietta Burrows has the first question. Henrietta, welcome. Please ask your question.
Yes.
Dr. Connor, I believe.
Yes, it was of Dr. Connor. And I'm wondering right now, it seems that the question was answered in terms of the negative effects that ending birthright citizenship would have. And I'm just wondering, Dr. Connor and the other speakers, do you think that how is it that the Trump administration seems to be unmindful of all of the negative effects that ending birthright citizenship would bring? And what do you think their fallback is in terms of making up for all of the negative consequences that would ensue?
Well, I will not pretend to be able to be in the mind of the Trump administration right now, but I would posit that often, and this may be the case no matter what administration's in power at the time, often not thinking of the long-term future impacts that such policies will have. As already demonstrated, the economic accounting of birthright citizenship beneficiaries going in the future is massive. We know that having that access to U.S. citizenship will lift populations to be able to access post-secondary education, part of a workforce. A workforce that I want to emphasize is getting smaller in terms of our working age population into the future. You know, our working age population is only growing through immigration today. And if you continue to actually diminish that even further by those that are born in the United States to undocumented and temporary immigrant parents, in this case related to the executive order, you're diminishing the future of that workforce even further. And just in terms of straight up math of how that's going to play out. And if we think work shortages or labor shortages are existing today, only imagine how that would even be even more magnified when you remove millions of potential workers in the future that won't have access to that workforce, that are almost in some ways assumed to be there, even though they're yet to be born. So I think that it's just more of a concept of not looking future like, and to be able to get a sense of what's going to happen in the forward 10 decades, and maybe just looking at the present and current political concerns or political moments. So looking to the future, I think, is really critical in this space.
Thank you. Orhan Akurt has the next questions, actually one for Dr. Geller and one for Xiao. Orhan, welcome.
Thank you. Which question do you want me to start?
Start with either one, please.
Okay. So I have what unintended consequences could arise if children born without citizenship were denied access to public service like the school or healthcare in light of the 14th Amendment to United States Constitution?
Dr. Geller, I believe that question is for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can imagine a lot of negative consequences if children are barred from school. Most immediately, the question is, what are children doing all day? School is not only a really important source of learning for the future, but also a really important source of daycare for working parents, and helps keep children focused during the day on a positive endeavor that helps them and prepares them for their future. This was a really active conversation in California while they also debated barring children from school is what exactly are we expecting kids to do all day? Some parents can afford to send their children to private schools at their own cost, but most most Americans aren't prepared to pay for that for all of the years of their kids' schooling. This would be a really big challenge, I think. And then the longer term impact is having a large population that's not well educated and is not prepared to contribute as much as they could to the workforce. Some families might be pushed out of the country. I think that that's the Trump administration's hope, is that they can just have this confluence of policies across so many different domains that convince people they should leave the United States. But in reality, there are a lot of reasons why people are here, and still a lot of really amazing opportunities for safety and economic mobility in the United States. And I think many people would stay and just live much more difficult lives.
Yeah.
Orhan, you had a
Yeah.
question for Zhao.
Yes, as how might, restricting birthright citizenship impact H-1B families and their US-born children here? In the meantime, this is, just additional questions. So if the H-1B visa is getting hard to get in United States, but the companies, they don't hire even in United States anymore. So unemployment is raising. So it's kind of little bit economy question, but it might affect the H-1 visa. What do you think about that kind of switch as well?
So this year has been the biggest change in the H-1B process in decades. So I'll answer your two questions in order. The first is what happens with the end of birthright citizenship on children of H-1B holders. And what is interesting about this situation is that it's already happening. Right? So there are certain countries of origin, namely India, where it may take 10, 20 years for someone to go from an H-1B to a green card because of the annual country caps. And in those cases, some of these H-1B workers will have children, and those children bringing those over their kids over early when they're young, and now they're actually aging out of the system, which means that these children, H-1B professionals, grew up in America, right? They attended American schools. All intents and purposes have only known America. Their friends are here. They plan for their life here. But when they turn 21, they actually age out of H-4 dependent status, and at which point they need to find another status. Now, some can switch over to an F1, a student visa, as they go through college, but all of a sudden they are a temporary immigrant again, right? In their legal status, while they may not ever have thought that way from a mental readiness perspective. And those who are not in school may actually have to leave the country, a country which they may have maybe the only life that they've really ever known. And so we are seeing now, family members and their parents are desperately, as they come up to this aging out point, applying for green card categories they don't qualify for, spending tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, on consultants and legal fees to only get denied, with the hopes of trying to get permanent legal status for their children. And so so if you apply this for everyone, now this will be a situation where a significantly more proportion of young people who grew up, spent their life here, will be suddenly treated by immigration purposes as a foreigner from somewhere else. And if we've already seen this with DACA, of people who are caught in this position, we're just creating a new class of folks who are in this no-win situation where they're technically citizens of a country that they have no connection to.
Thank
And
you.
then related, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to take more questions, Zhao, but you said related.
Because there was a second question around the H-1B policies in general, and what happened this year was really interesting. In which case that not only was there the $100,000 fee attached to people applying from abroad, which lowered the total number of applications dramatically, we estimate by about half. And they added weighted scoring for H-1B applications, where meaning that the higher your wage level, the more entries you had into this, what was previously a random lottery. We've actually seen the highest overall H-1B selection rates ever. And so if you are a US educated new graduate, especially of a higher paying domain in a high and ideally with an advanced degree, your odds of being selected in some cases are north of 80%, whereas historically it's been in the 20 to 30% range. And so this is definitely the administration putting their thumb on the scale. The same to say, hey, if you're outside the country, it's very hard to get in. If you're a doctor from Mexico, you're not going to get hired at a rural community anymore. But if you are a PhD AI computer scientist grad in the US, you now have a expectation that you can actually win the lottery and stay in the country.
Thank you. Rebecca Bartis has the next question for Dr. Connor. Rebecca.
Thank you. The 14th Amendment makes it very clear that all people born in the US are considered US citizens. So I'm wondering, what is the Trump administration's legal rationale for challenging birthright citizenship?
Yeah, I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't know if I can answer that one. Clearly, Rebecca worked more on the economic and demographic components here. And if our previous guest that was recorded would be the ultimate person, so maybe that question can actually be directed to him. But ultimately, it's based on the 14th Amendment and the clarification of that and that interpretation of it. But in terms of looking to that kind of future aspect, I think one thing that we need to be kind of considering here is not just the legal aspect, but also of just, essentially money left on the table in many ways. That if you were to not have that right to birthright citizenship that's been in practice for so long, for the past decades, 150 years, you would see these kind of trillions of dollars that perhaps couldn't be achieved within our economy. And I think if we truly want to be a country, and that's just a question to throw out there, if we want to be a country that actually is growing and one that's actually an economy that's growing, and we don't want to be becoming smaller but bigger and more apt and ready for the global competitiveness that continues to exist and will in the future, then we'd want a country that actually allows for that kind of growth, and that would involve having to continuing and maintaining that level of birthright citizenship that we've experienced in the past, as this evidence demonstrates.
Thank you. Dr. Gelli, this next question is for you, and I'm going to ask it in the interest of time. What were the arguments that the majority made in Plyler versus Stowe to guarantee that all children in the U.S. have access to public school education?
Yeah, in the Supreme Court's ruling, the majority basically said, okay, you are arguing Texas school district, that local Texas school district, that if you exclude unauthorized immigrant children, that you'll save money because these are children that you don't need to educate in your system. But you fail to look at both sides of the ledger, that there are also costs that come, big societal costs that would come from denying children an education. And so it was arguably a policy ruling, and I think that's why there are a lot of conversations today about how a challenge might proceed. The other argument that they made was that children shouldn't be held responsible for decisions that their parents made. The children didn't opt to come to the country without authorization. Often they were too young to even know what was happening or that they were moving across national borders. So there was a fairness argument there.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but I'd like each speaker to present their 30-second soundbite, the most important point that you'd like to leave with our reporters. Xiao, why don't we go to you first?
Well, America, since basically World War II, has had a singular monopoly on the world. And that monopoly is as a place where the people who want to make a better life for themselves and their family can have the biggest opportunity to do so. Not an equal opportunity, but they have that opportunity. And that monopoly has created the decades of prosperity and progress that we have all benefited from today. And the continued sets of policy decisions to make America a less attractive place for people to build to better the lives of their future generations will eventually, not in 5 years, not in 10 years, but over in the 20+ year time horizon, make America far less competitive as a country than it has been over the last century.
Thank you, Xiao. Julia.
Xiao, I feel like you just stole what I was going to say, which is that immigration has been such a secret sauce of the success of the United States. Immigration has driven our population growth and our economic growth, our labor force growth, and just all of the tremendous innovation that has led to all of the many amazing leading companies that we have here and the strength of our economy and our society as well, just the diversity that we have culturally here in the United States. And children of immigrants have been such a huge part of that. They've been successful over subsequent generations and really contributed to the country. We're threatening to shoot ourselves in the foot in taking that away, but it does seem like all of the lawyers in my life are saying the same thing, that this executive order is not going to stand. So I think we can look forward to continuing that tradition.
Thank you, Julia. Philip, last word to you.
Well, in light of the executive order and the challenge that is brought to the Supreme Court, I think we need to be looking at the greater implications of such a standing if the executive order were to stand going forward. And there's certainly the demographic component, which has already been mentioned earlier, millions of people that would become part of an underclass, but also an economic story here that is perhaps less appreciated, one that would last well into the future for decades longer, as much as $1 trillion that could be lost within the economy, and 400,000 or even more individuals that wouldn't be working in occupations that require some level of college because they would have limited access to that post-secondary education. So these are factors that must be weighed, not in terms necessarily of the legal case, but in terms of how we define what it means to live in the United States and who belongs into the future.